morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sheng, former, I said the Distinguished Fellow, Asia Global Institute. Let me say how privileged I am to have the great and the good of Asia and the world here for the Asia Global Dialogue. You know, when my great friend Michael Spence, a Nobel laureate, says that he is a sidekick of Victor Fung, I can only say that I am the sidekick of Victor Fung. It's under his leadership, and William, and Mike. I had the privilege of working to start off the predecessor of Asia Global Institute, the Fung Global Institute. So we are here today, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants. And they have set the vision and the tone. And today's agenda is to redefine multilateralism and globalization in a new age. And if you look at the program, I want to congratulate Director Chen Zhiwu for framing it very, very well, because, you know, immediately after this, you know, we're supposed to talk about global agenda, but the next session is going to talk about globalization. Then we have breakout sessions on trade, gender. Nolene is going to lead an all-women panel, if I'm not wrong, on this very, very important subject. And as Chairman Mao used to say, women hold up half the world. And if the one-child policy, you know, has led to a situation, it is that the women, half the population of private enterprises in China, are going to inherit half the wealth of China. So, you know, the gender change is going to be huge. And then there is this security issue. Now, we're very lucky because we've got General Narasimhan here. The latest Pew poll discovered that 20% of Americans trust media, 44% trust finance, and 80% trust the military. So we're going to get, you know, a military comment here. The last one, of course, is on artificial intelligence. Now, I'm a great believer in acronyms because artificial intelligence and AS stands for augmented stupidity. So you know, we're in this age of technology, and if I may frame globalization from the American perspective, or multilateralism, as we define it, was defined by the Americans. It was defined by G1. And the problem that we face today is that the G1 has decided when we're moving to G20, the multilateralism is being rethought by G1. So the G19 and the rest of the world is actually saying, what the hell's going on? And that's why it's that order has become disorder, right? And this conversation is going on not just in the rest of the world, but as Mike, you know, insightfully said, is going on in the United States. So we are in a very difficult phase, and the whole purpose of this dialogue is to give what Victor calls the Asian perspectives. Now, why is this Asian perspective particularly important in this panel? It's because it's extremely diverse, except for the fact that we're all men. So, but Nolene will take care of that. You know, there's the same thing like with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is all about diversity, and the GOP stands for grumpy old men. The party of grumpy old men. But here we are men who are represented by what I call magic. I'm from Malaysia. Malaysians are very recalcitrant. Then Allan Gyngell, you know, the leading thinker in Australia about Australian foreign policy. Hitoshi Tanaka-san, who is both educated in the two of the finest universities, Kyoto and Oxford, and the leading thinker about, you know, Japanese international affairs. Then General Narasimhan, who has not only had first-hand action, you know, but also is a fluent Chinese speaker. And then after they've given a diverse view, Professor Chen Zhiwu, as director, will answer or provide its perspective of how China may think about, this global agenda issues. So MAJIC, magic. And that's the whole purpose of welcoming you all here. Thank you very much. Let's start. Allan.
Thank you, Gopal.
Yeah,
That's a good one.
Whatever you want.
Thanks. It's hard to match that. Thanks very much to Andrew and the Asian Global Institute. It's really wonderful to be here and on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. There couldn't be a more important time for people from all over the region to be talking frankly and directly about these issues. I'm Australian, and that's the perspective I'm going to be bringing. I've been working on Australian foreign policy and our relations with Asia for many decades now. I've written a history of Australian foreign policy, so I'm confident when I say that Australia has never faced a period since 1942 as complicated and as difficult as this one. Australia did remarkably well out of the post-Second World War order. We were an ally of the most powerful state in the world, which was also the regional hegemon. We had a deep economic complementarity with the emerging economies of North Asia as the Asian economic miracle got underway. Our principal economic partner, Japan, was a member of the same alliance system that we were. And multilateral institutions like the UN and the WTO provided a framework for the establishment of rules, whether those were the rules of trade or of the law of the sea or of arms control, which gave middle-sized powers like us predictability in international dealings. But that particular post-war international order is, in my view, finished. It's not being challenged, it's not changing, it's over. And the reason is that economic power in the world is shifting, driven by technology and other factors. And that means that the two countries of most importance to Australia, the United States and China, are no longer status quo powers. Both of them want something different in the world, and that's new. China has moved beyond hide and bide. It wants a place in the world commensurate with its economic weight. The United States no longer thinks that its interests are consistently well served by the multilateral system which it itself put in place after the Second World War. Now, this general trend is not likely to change. China, certainly, like any huge economy, will encounter cyclical challenges and unexpected crises, but its relative strength will continue to grow. And future US administrations will, I'm sure, be more familiar and normal for us than the Trump administration, but dimensions of an America First agenda will continue. I think we saw in Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side and George W. Bush on the Republican side the high watermark of US liberal internationalism for the foreseeable future. As both countries adjust, however, the chance of miscalculation is very real and very dangerous for the rest of us. The speed with which the US-China relationship has moved from engagement to strategic competition has surprised and worried me. The speech by Vice President Pence was a recent example of that, but maybe even more dramatic for me was a speech that Hank Paulson, who's long been a great supporter of the US-China relationship, gave about a week ago rather. For me, it's like looking through a microscope and seeing a cell divide in front of you, and trade, technology, education, research exchanges, defence. Now, all that's a very deep problem for Australia. No Australian political party argues for the abandonment of our alliance with the United States. About 80% of Australians consistently support it in opinion polling. But China is our largest trading partner by an enormous amount. Australia's trade with China is greater than our trade with the next two partners, Japan and the United States combined. It's the largest source of new investment. It's the largest source of new immigrants to the country. It's hard to think of any important issue in Australia's future, from the rules of trade to what happens in Antarctica, in which China will not play a major part. Australian policymakers have been responding to this by insisting that Australia doesn't have to choose between the US and China. We saw the Prime Minister saying it just the day before yesterday. But sadly for our policymakers, choices are coming very fast. How should we respond? One way has been to reframe our region in a broader context as the Indo-Pacific. Now, Australia did this before others. The idea of the Indo-Pacific first appears in Australian official documents back in 2009, and it makes sense for us. If you're Australia, you've got the Indian Ocean on one side, you've got the Pacific Ocean on the other side, and you've got Southeast Asia as the central pivot point between. The structure of the 21st century Indo-Pacific is not going to look like the structure of the 20th century Asia-Pacific. The energy to control the international system is not going to come from a single power source. It's going to have to come from a networked grid. Instead of the hub and spokes security alliance system that we saw in the 20th century and the broad multilateral organisations, we need more diverse and fluid set of relationships, groups and coalitions to address the security and the economic challenges that are coming. Now, sometimes these are going to be designed to cooperate, sometimes they're going to be designed to compete, sometimes China will be central to these, sometimes it won't be involved. China is inevitably going to play a larger role in regional affairs, and we need to ensure that the region into which it rises is one in which all voices are heard and in which rules which we've all played a part in setting are followed. Now, that objective is simply stated, but its execution will be as hard as anything we've ever had to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Allan. Wonderful. Now, Tanaka-san.
Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me. This is my first time to be here, but this is a great hall. I would probably love to talk to you for about 5 minutes, I suppose. I spent my 36 years in the Japanese Foreign Office, retiring as Deputy Foreign Minister, and I spent another 13 years in the private sector. So my view is more or less combined, mixed perspective on the part of Japan. Now let me bring back you to the past 150, 160 years. You all know that since Japan was opened up in 1853 by America, Japan rose very quickly. Japan fought 3 wars altogether. 2 wars with China. First war, successfully defeating big China. And 2 wars. After all, Japan was defeated by the United States. So this is it. The rising power all the time got conflict with the status quo power. The question we are having today is China this time rose in a very, very rapid manner. Since the end of the Cold War, China surpassed Japan in terms of GDP in 2010. The question of Japan, China, US relationship is moving at 40 years interval. The normalization of the relationship between Japan and China, between United States, Japan was made in 1972. 40 years, almost 40 years since then, 2010, China became second largest economy of the world. 40 years since then, 2050, this is a magic number. China says by the time 2050, China would be the greatest strong socialist power. So the whole question you have to confront with, how to manage 40 years when China is growing, and many people assume that China will surpass the United States as #1 economy of the world. That's the historical perspective. Let me talk about my own perspective in relation to the 30 years from now. Xi Jinping talks about China dream. China dream is to return to the glories before the Opium War, before Japan-China War. And we have concerns because it does mean, in most of the eyes of the Japanese, it may mean that China wishes to have a hegemon in the region. United States, as we all know from the statement by Vice President in Hudson Institute, China is a sharp power. China is intruding into our society. If you just take all those speeches on the surface, we may conclude that there may be a likelihood of confrontation, conflict, even war. I have a very different response to this. This may be a very sort of minority view. I don't think there is that type of conflict, confrontation, or even war. Because if Chinese were to confront with the United States today, it's very, very obvious that the United States would crush China in terms of military capability, in terms of political capability, in terms of economic capability. The United States today is by far superior to China. You may ask, what about 20 years from now? China may surpass the United States in terms of economic strength, so is military capability. But even at that time, I don't think China would dare to challenge the United States. Why? Because the question is economy. Question is economy. Chinese will not be entertaining sort of population bonus any longer. The whole question, Chinese Communist Party, there is a very strong need for growth. Without growth, the government wouldn't exist. Therefore, Chinese Communist Party would pursue how to make sure that economic growth continues. In order for, not just for China, but for any country, in order to get higher economic growth, you have to have innovation. I am entirely sure after this globalization, after this populism which was created by globalization, it won't last too long because populism doesn't create wealth in the world. Rather, population destroys by cutting immigration, by introducing a protectionist movement. It will not create prosperity. Therefore, it will die out very soon. What comes next? That is innovation. If a country is good at making innovation, that country will become to rise. So let's compare. Which country United States or China are good at innovation? Now I have to conclude. The West, what we call West, capitalism supported by people's freedom is much more likely to produce innovation, because that would have to be based upon incentives. The kind of one-party rule, would it create an incentive or not? Therefore, even after 20 years, even after 30 years, I do not believe that there is going to be a very conflictive situation between the United States and China. My conclusion is, having said that, China is bound to change. China is bound to change. And we, Japan, stand to gain a lot by China changing, reforming themselves. This time, Japanese Prime Minister visited China, and I mean, it's a good thing, great visit, because the relationship was somewhat very cold for the past 1 year. But now, it has returned to the normalcy, and they have agreed about 52 joint projects in the third country. Chinese may say this is part of road and belt project. Japanese say, well, no. This is the joint infrastructure project between Japan and China. But Japanese made it very clear, we would like to make this infrastructure project high quality, transparent, based upon international law. This is it. The reason why we feel very strong about it. We will lose a lot if China either were to pursue a hegemon in the region, or China failing to reform. Either way, we lose a lot, because it's very clear. In 1989, when the Cold War was ending, United States is by far, economically, Japan's the most important trade partner. 30% of Japan's trade was with the United States. Today, our share of trade with the US went down to 15%, China 25%. Very, very clear. We are going to be very, very dependent on China, Chinese market. Our interdependent relationship will flourish. One assumption, let us do jointly. Let us do cooperative way. That's the reason why I strongly support such venture like TPP, like RCEP. Japan is in the center of it. Japan is in the center of it. If we were able to use all these two, TPP and RCEP, to expand it much wider, regional, economic framework, then we will say to the US, sorry, Mr. Trump, this is a much better way. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. General Narasimhan.
Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be here in the Asian Global Dialogue this year. I'm going to cover on 3 issues. One is the global impact of local political development that have been happening in US, China, and in this region. The second thing is on the global and regional multilateralism effects on trade and security. And the third one is the threats to geopolitical peace agenda. These are the 3 main things that I'm going to speak about. If you look at the local issues that are dominating in China, USA, and in this region, if you take at China, politically it is stable. Economically, the trade dispute is happening, but the impact of it is yet to be seen. If you analyze it, it's not clearly visible as yet. China has reacted in a manner that it has taken a number of steps to overcome this trade dispute. You can count any number of them: alternate markets, currency swap agreements, and the like. There is a tentativeness which can be felt when we interact with some delegations from China, but the trade agreement with the USA is still being negotiated, and we don't know as to what shape it will take place. So therefore, as far as the economy is concerned, it's in a state of flux. Militarily, if you look at it, the reforms that China announced in November 2015 have taken effect, and the military is still evolving with those concepts, and it is likely to take some more time. So this is the way you see, in a nutshell, where China is. As far as the USA is concerned, you find that the recent elections that have taken place have brought in the advantage to the Republicans in the Senate and in the House of Representatives to the Democrats. That is likely to have a little bit of implications on the decision-making processes. But as far as the view on China is concerned, one gets the feeling that there is a bipartisan agreement on what is happening with China. As far as the US economy is concerned, it is showing sense of growth. Average growth in the last 2 quarters seems to be 3.15%. Unemployment is reducing, and the consumer spending seems to be up in the US. So economically, it seems to be doing better. Militarily, we found the president announcing the defense budget, which is all-inclusive, and he has laid out his plans in the National Defense Strategy, which is clearly visible. As far as this region is concerned, number of countries are going for elections very soon. Starting from India, Bangladesh, Maldives have just finished with their elections, Pakistan has just finished their elections, and so the new governments are either coming or they're going to come in, and that is going to shape the way the region looks at things in the near future. The other thing that comes up is how is it impacting the global scenario? One is the US policies which have affected or resulted in a pullback from the US on many issues is releasing up a lot of space. And who is going to occupy that space is the question mark. At the moment, it seems to be that China is moving in to occupy these spaces. So that is going to have its own implications in the entire region and the world order. And if you look at China, China is facing at too many fronts. You take East China Sea, South China Sea, trade dispute, One Belt, One Road, MIC 2025, you can keep counting it. As a result, what is happening is there is a feeling that there are opportunities that are coming up in terms of trade, more stable relationships, and how long this particular change will happen or how long this opportunities will last is unpredictable at this point in time. It will all depend on how things shape up in the near future. Coming on to point number 2, there is the global and regional multilateralism and how it is affecting trade. We talked about globalization, we talked about deglobalization, and this tussle we have just seen the beginnings of it. It is just going to keep on going ahead for some more time before it stabilizes. And combined with it is the fact of nationalism and the protectionism that we get to see. And these two, if you put it in one matrix with globalization and deglobalization, I think this trend is going to continue for some more time to come. This trade dispute, which is between US and China that is happening, that is forcing countries to accommodate, looking at alternate markets, shifting of manufacturing facilities and currency swap agreements, etc., etc. Again, how long this opportunity trend will last us in the economic field is yet to be, it's quite unpredictable at this point in time. In terms of security, national and traditional security and non-traditional security is becoming a huge challenge. In the non-traditional security threats, we have seen terrorism and lone wolf kind of attacks increasing in dominance, and that the strategies to counter them are yet to be put in place. Therefore, the collective security mechanisms need strengthening. And we found this the code of conduct for the South China Sea, that single negotiating draft test has come out. The contents are not visible very clearly, but however, the contents of it has been discussed in the media. Basically, what it says is there is a lot of things to be negotiated before we get into a common kind of a security understanding, either regionally or globally. Threats to geopolitical peace agenda is this third point I wanted to discuss about. Firstly, there is a lack of common understanding of this threat. Today, it is extremely difficult to find a common understanding on the definition of, say, even terrorism for that matter. So that is actually holding up a lot of regulatory mechanisms that can be put into place. The nation-centric approaches are gaining momentum, and this is another problem that you will face in the geopolitical peace agenda. We also see too many regional and sub-regional groupings. Each starts with a particular agenda, particularly it moves on to the security-related issues. So you find too many of these regional and sub-regional groupings which are actually not helping. You need to probably look at consolidating and synergizing these particular groupings and regional as well as the global groupings. To that extent, I would say that India has projected two of the concepts. So one is SAGA, which is security and growth for all in the region, and the other one is secure, that is basically looking at security, economic development, connectivity, respect for sovereignty and environment, etc. That seems to be the way to go. I'll stop here and we'll take on further in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Chen.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, my welcome to all of you to Asia Global Dialogue of 2018. Of course, as you can see so far, we have my colleagues especially put together so many great minds to engage in discussions and dialogues on global issues. So I was asked to share with you my understanding of the China perspectives on the global order. As you can see, so far, like from yesterday to now, every speaker has mentioned China from whatever angles. So from that, we can infer China is so important in all the global discussions on economic development and so on. But I have to say that China is a new player. It does not really have the kind of experience many of us would like to see. Maybe one concrete example from my own experience is what I observed or heard 16 years ago. So at the end of 2002, CCTV asked me to talk about the global economy together with an expert on Latin America, especially Argentina. So he was a very senior researcher, policy advisor in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, in particular the Latin American Institute. I mean, at that time, 16 years ago, that was the most prominent think tank advising the government on Latin America. So in the makeup room, I was so excited because I asked him, when I asked him, I said, I've never met anyone in China, who is a Latin American expert. So I said, it must have been so painful for you to fly all the way from Beijing to Argentina so often, right? You have to change planes in North America and then take another long flight to Argentina. And then he said, actually, I've never been to Argentina. So that tells you the state of things as of 16 years ago. We do have a few Latin American Asia Global Fellows here, so you should keep that in mind. But let me turn to the recent experience over the last 2 years as an example to highlight how this learning process has evolved as far as China-US policies are concerned. As all of you can recall, 2 years ago, when Trump first got elected, or when he was campaigning very energetically, actively towards the end of, towards November 2016, he promised a lot of tariffs against China, something like 40% or 45%. Then many of my friends and observers in China were saying, don't worry, okay, all American presidential campaigns are like this. They first talk very tough during the campaign. Then once they become president, then they face reality, talk much more mildly about China. And then a few months being in the White House, then they would become a very close pro-China friend. So that was the case with Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and then Bush Jr., and then Obama. Okay, so everyone was expecting to see a repetition of the previous cycles, right? And then in particular, I was told that because Trump is known to be such a transactional businessman, so that's exactly what China is familiar with in terms of what kind of leaders and business people they are willing to, they're more comfortable dealing with. As many of you know, in different African countries, China has succeeded for the most part by offering goodies to this president and that president, and then they all came in very nicely. So they thought, okay, instead of having Hillary Clinton, who actually is so, well, I know some of you may have different views, so sticky about her positions and her values and principles, whereas Trump has no principles, right? So if you offer him something nice and good terms, especially tangible economic benefits, he will treat you as his very close friend. So China was very happy to see that Trump actually got elected. Of course, then the surprise came last year. Before the surprise, actually, I should also highlight the short honeymoon period. As you all recall, late last year, Trump made a visit, a big official visit to China. And President Xi treated Trump and his wife so nicely by offering them a dinner at the Forbidden City. No prior Chinese leaders had ever done that to anyone, okay? So Trump felt very good. And then at the end of that trip, everyone I talked to in China said, now we're really back to the old cycle. Trump is in our hands, okay? The real surprise came early this year when just Trump turned around to launch, to impose tariffs on Chinese imports. At that time, whenever I visited the mainland on TV or in the different official newspapers, so many experts that were acceptable to the party were saying, no problem, okay. Trump making such threats, he's just bluffing. Our economy is in much better shape than the US. And in particular, our president, especially the party, control everything, whereas Trump controls nothing, right? So in case of a real trade war with the US, the party can mobilize whatever resources very quickly. You all remember the 4 trillion renminbi stimulus efforts right back in 2008, how China was able to turn the financial crisis into a booming development period. So that's why our Australian friends and Japanese friends and even Indian friends were all happy to see that, well, as long as China was stimulating, we would all benefit. So based on that experience, so this time around, if Trump would go crazy on China, then China would have no problem, okay? So we just stimulate again and use all the resources to fight, okay? And so that was the general thinking. And then, of course, came in April, the big shock. As many of you know, ZTE, this telecom company, right, was sanctioned by the Department of Commerce because the Department of Commerce issued this sanction, forbidding any American business exporting the needed parts to ZTE, and then that led to a complete halt of all production for ZTE, and it has over 100,000 employees on the payroll at the company and different subsidiaries. That led to a major soul searching in all of China, because before April of this year, everybody thought, we're such a strong economy, such a strong nation, we can fight with anyone. And then this one company, ZTE, led to this big halt. And then everyone was turning around thinking, wow, actually, we're not as strong as we thought. Okay, I should not say more about this. So after that, there was some reassessment. So the attitudes toward the US trade war negotiations also changed. As you recall, then Vice Premier Liu He led a team to go to Washington in early May, so offering some concessions, and then the Treasury Secretary on the US side reached some agreement with Liu He and his team. Of course, then there was celebration again in China, as well as among some circles in the US. So 2 weeks later, just when everyone thought there was peace, Trump just threw all the terms and agreement into the trash can, and then still wanted to go ahead with tariffs. Of course, that led to a major reassessment in China again, especially almost totally discredited Vice Premier Liu He. So that led to the next period of no contact, no negotiations whatsoever, because, hey, I understand, from China's perspective, we don't know whom to talk to. Yesterday, Sam was talking about not knowing whom to talk to. I mean, China had that same exact problem. Who is the real person representing the United States of America in negotiating with China? So then there was no contact, okay? But then after that experience in May, this past summer was a major reassessment period. So that lasted for several months, including some of the key players at a very senior level, thinking that we thought we have taken care of the key decision makers, especially by relying on Wall Street executives, bottling them up and then getting them to lobby on Trump and others. And then, of course, did not work out. So that's why in September and October, different Wall Street, as well as former Wall Street people, including Robert Zoellick and others, were invited to have dialogues in Beijing. In particular, one person I should not mention the name of was so unhappy. He thought the Wall Street executives and former Wall Street executives have been convinced to help China. And then, of course, last week, Navarro was really very direct in criticizing the shuttle diplomacy managed by Wall Street types. So things are going crazy. But I think from this whole brief history, you can see that this learning process, of course, we all have been learning more and more about Trump. But even if we put aside Trump, this learning experience has been pretty long. And I would say partly because if you work in China, whether you're inside the government or outside the government, when the news media, right, what is reported in China, it's so controlled. So even the close advisors cannot avoid being too much framed with the China perspective. And then that makes it very difficult to understand the other perspectives. So the situation China is in, as far as the US-China relations are concerned, is quite telling, quite informative. So I hope later this month some agreement can be reached between the two countries to take out whatever ambiguity and uncertainty there is about the new framework for trade between the two countries and also between these two countries and other countries. But I have to say that personally, I think I'm not too optimistic because even if some trade agreement is reached, other dimensions of confrontation and misunderstanding and so on will continue for a while to come. Let me just stop here without taking too much time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chen. I'm glad you brought up the idea of honeymoons moving into the period of divorces. And in this age of multilateralism, we have moved from monogamy to polygamy, that we have to have multiple relations. So we've had a very rich and insightful, very wise comments from everybody, how all these regional experts, let me put it this way, got no Americans here, but each one of us look at China, US, global situation from their own unique perspectives. Let me, since Zhiwu has just spoken, let me start with General Narasimhan first. Coming from India, there is this sign that now, we really now need to think about bringing India into the whole perspective. From the Chinese perspective, it looks as if it's a kind of a containment strategy. How does India look at this, South Asia, East Asia, dialogue?
The basic premise is the whole concept of this has been laid out by our Prime Minister during our Shangri-La dialogue. We look at an open and an inclusive kind of a system in this particular region, and that is why this concept of Indo-Pacific, which you mentioned, which has been in the discussions for quite some time now. ASEAN centrality is something that we are looking at. We are looking at an open and an inclusive system, and we are looking at a free flow of commerce and trade through the global commons. And if you look at all this, there is a feeling that this entire region needs to synergize its efforts in some form or the other. And notwithstanding the bilateral kind of problems that all these countries have, ultimately you need to look at a more synergized kind of an inclusive kind of an effort that needs to be built up between these two regions.
So it's a very multi-dimensional dialogues rather than focus on one particular party. It's very, very good. Tanaka-san, I really like your insight. I think Japan plays such a very important role in Asia. It's not just about China. Japan, ASEAN, the whole India, South Asia, Australia. But Japan's perspective, you've taken a long historical perspective. But elaborate a little bit about this. Is the economic relationship enough? As Professor Michael Spence said quite rightly, economics was blind to politics. The political model was ignored, and now politics is now here big time.
Let me say two things. First, the whole thing from now on is a question of the competition among the systems. We talk about what we call state capitalism. We talked about free market-oriented capitalism as well. End of the day, the question is, which is the better system for getting sufficient growth? And I do think the state capitalism would have to transform themselves to a much freer market mechanism. Therefore, by trading, by making investment, by introducing rules, we may possibly be able to change the very rigid Chinese system to somewhat more transparent. That's point number one. Point number two, even under that type of project, we need to think about the question of security as well. And when you talk about security, are we talking about the question of, for instance, senkaku, when Chinese and Japanese are obviously confronting? If China were to attack the island, there's going to be a war. No question about that, and the United States is going to be involved. That will not happen because we are so economically interdependent. But yet, we need to enhance the security role in the region as well. For that, question of Korean Peninsula, that is going to be addressed among the region as a whole. As long as North Korea continues to develop nuclear weapon, I don't think there is any peace in the region. Suppose the region, I don't think there is any disagreement among the region. China, Korea, Japan, United States, India, Australia, all want North Korea to get rid of their nuclear weapon. The question is how and how soon. For that, I think those countries in the region with one clear objective of denuclearization of Korean Peninsula can work together on that security. And that type of framework, I do think that six-party talk would be one of the best for the purpose of confidence-building measures. Once we succeeded in creating that confidence-building measures, specifying Korean Peninsula, but end of the day, that would become much more broader sort of confidence mechanism in the region. So if you, a person like self, an optimist, 10 years, 20 years since then, there is a, very good confidence-building mechanism in the form of aftermath of six-party talks, on the one hand, and on the other, we have regional free trade mechanism centering upon TPP and RCEP. I hope that TPP and RCEP would be joined together so that we can have a little bit higher rule-based community. So that's my vision.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Allan, let's now talk about Australia and Asia. I think you highlighted the fact that, China is such an important customer, but at the same time, Australia is such a staunch ally of the United States that's sometimes called, if I'm not wrong by an Indonesian, that Australia is the deputy sheriff in the Pacific. The key question really now is, going forward, how does Australia now see the Asian, let me go back a little to the history of this issue. The rise of America as a global power was when Mahan realized that global power was naval power. And then America moved into air power. And now the differences of opinion, put it this way, with China is who is going to be the leader in cyberspace. How does Australia look at all this? Where is this firewall of deglobalization going to come in the cyberspace issue from the Australian perspective? Since you're a leader in this area.
Well, this is why the whole situation that Australia faces now is so, as I said, so complex and so difficult. We have a very deep interest in China's continued growth and our continuing sort of economic complementarity, whether it's on resources or energy or services with China. On the other hand, the security issues that we face and that were alluded to by Professor Spence before are quite deep. And Australia has moved earlier than a number of other countries in some areas, for example, to make it clear that Chinese providers will not be able to enter the 5G build in Australia, because the view of our security agencies is that 5G is so structurally different in nature from what's gone before that it makes you can't make a distinction between what happens at the core and what happens at the periphery, as we've been able to do earlier. So we've made that decision. We've taken a couple of other decisions on investment, which China has not liked, but we've made it clear what the reasons were, and we've pointed to the issues of reciprocity, which are involved. And I think we're now moving into a period where very old-fashioned ideas like reciprocity are going to have more traction than they have.
Thank you. Zhiwu, one last question before we open to the floor. Zhiwu, the issue here is, China has erected, if I may put it this way, certainly in the internet space, what I call a silk firewall. We don't allow Google, Facebook, in China, and that's a silk firewall, right? Because as Zheng said, when we open the windows, flies will come in. The silk firewall stops that flies, coming in. But now, the world is building the economic iron curtain. Maybe it's you can call it the double firewall. You want a firewall, we build another one. So in this evolution of cyberspace, cyber technology issue, how do you see China, responding to this?
My observations indicate to me that most officials in China believe they can contain and control the information flow. As many of us have experienced, when you go to China, then, as you said, you cannot use Google or Facebook. And many of us have been trying VPN, but what I've learned is even with VPN, they can selectively block whichever website they want to block. So the New York Times, whenever there's any important thing going on in China, then I've learned that the New York Times, CNN, and others are still blocked with or without VPN. But I think as long as they keep the VPN options and the internet open to whatever limited extent, the information flow still cannot be totally controlled. Although I have to say now, with so many video cameras everywhere in China, they ultimately control every individual's behavior. So even if you have more information, better understanding of the outside world, when you know you are controlled, you're monitored, watched every second, right? Then you still want to stay very quiet. So the cyberspace overall so far has really transformed China, not just in terms of ideas, but also all the e-commerce and internet this, internet that within China have really revolutionized the society and the economy.
Yeah, basically what you're really saying is that in the internet age, everybody is entangled with each other through networks that, the firewalls may not necessarily be able to filter out completely, right? That the viruses will always be there. And the question is how you deal with this virus. Before we let me just, raise this fundamental point, which General Narasimhan is an expert. Terrorism is really a virus. How do you deal with this, in this global age?
That is the reason I mentioned this in my initial remarks also. Today, we are faced with a situation where we don't even agree on a common definition of terrorism. Terrorism for one person seems to be a national movement for the other person. So it becomes a little difficult to actually define this, what is terrorism actually speaking. And second thing is, in fact, there was a proposal to have a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. This came up somewhere in 92, 93. Under that format, some amount of agreements and understandings were done till about 2004-5. Beyond that, there has been no progress at all. So that is probably one way to go to find a common kind of a convention where you will be able to deal with terrorism in a manner which is acceptable globally and internationally. So that is probably the way to go.
Great. So, let's now, open up the time for questions and, real dialogue, not just, because we really have these wonderful experts here. What we're really, seeing is we have now moved from a multilateral globalist age of what was hope that there is light and there is, a greater enlightenment, not just for the West, but the whole world. What we have now seen in this new uncertainty is that the dark side of the web has surfaced. And how do we stop it, right? From not just within, but from outside. And that's struggling, in the dark side. And it's very easy, as Mike says, to think that the dark side is always immigration and the foreigners. How do we deal with this issue? So, the thing about the Asia Global Institute is that we really need to bring in these Asian perspectives. So let's now open up to the floor. Questions? There you are. Okay, right over there.
Hi, everyone. I'm Advanchu, Asia Global Fellow 2018. I have a question that we have been discussing a lot about this US-China trade relations, trade war and everything. In this context, how do you see India and China coming closer? Is this an opportunity? Because adversities always come with opportunities. Do we have any hope to see India and China working more closely together in terms of trade and growing together? Because we may change history, but we can't change geography, and both the countries are in the same region. Thank you.
Great. So I think it's addressed to me. Okay. As I said, even in my remarks, that this kind of a US-China trade dispute is opening up opportunities for other countries to come into play. In India-China context, there have been certain amount of improvement in the trade relationships. And it has also been facilitated by the fact that India and China had that informal summit in Wuhan in April this year. Afterwards, you found certain amount of softening of tariffs, etc., has taken place between India and China. The avenues for further cooperation in trade in terms of maybe soybean and other things, those things are opening up. But there are certain amount of problems that we do have in terms of entry barriers into China for Indian companies, etc., which are being negotiated over a period of time. Hopefully, there are some avenues getting opened out there. So there is a chance that both India and China can actually benefit from this in the sense that both are huge markets, both are growing economies, and I'm sure there are opportunities for both to benefit from this.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, Barry.
At the beginning of the 20th century, we were having greater globalization, interdependence, and a communications revolution with the telegraph. Are we sleepwalking towards war in the way that the powers did at the beginning of the 20th century?
Great question. Tanaka-san, why don't you start with this?
Let us think precisely what globalization has created. Globalization has created world wealth, no question about it. Globalization at the end of the Cold War, all those capitals moved away from the United States or from Japan, all those developed countries to a country where labor cost is cheap. And by doing so, it's a kind of overall, world economy is concerned, it has gone up. No question about it. It has created wealth. But at the same time, globalization has created very, very deep division, particularly in developed part of the world. Look at the United States, look at Europe, those who felt that they are not benefited from globalization, those are who felt all those established politicians did not do anything for us. They moved to Brexit, they moved to select Trump. And all those phenomena is seen as populism. So globalization has created world wealth, and again, power balance has changed consequently because all those developing countries has risen. So that's point number one. Point number two, globalization has created populism. And populism in the sense of exclusive nationalism is quite dangerous. You may say that Japan is an exemption. Japan has enjoying 2/3 majority of the House. The Prime Minister has got very strong power basis. But you can't deny the fact that there is a strong surge of nationalism, and strong surge of nationalism often, if it turns out to be exclusive, then, as Barry says, may lead to a war. But my take is, since populism will not create any wealth, populism will destroy it. Therefore, it won't prolong too long. One may say that Trump will last to the second term. I doubt it very much. One may say that Brexit is going to be the Brexit. I doubt it a little bit. Therefore, I do think that populism will end. Then comes, as I said, innovation. Innovation is the only way for us to avoid the split, division, conflict, confrontation. I think the innovation is the only way for the world to start prospering again.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. You've given us great hope about a shared future through innovation, not mutual destruction, right? Now, Allan, why don't you?
Yeah, well, let me pour a sort of glass of cold water over that. I sort of agree with Barry, I think. I think we could be sleepwalking into conflict. I mean, you know, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. I don't think we're going into a new Cold War, but I have personally been very surprised by the speed with which what you might call a neo-bipolarization has been taking over the world. The issues are very complex, and we've talked about some of them, including you know, populism and what you need to address it. The only way you get through periods like this is through effective statecraft. Effective statecraft requires people in leadership positions around the world to have a view which goes over the immediate horizon. We seem to be ill-served at the moment. I'm not just talking about the great powers all over the place. We seem to be ill-served by political leadership. So I think that we do need to be particularly alert to the dangers of stumbling into something which we don't expect in exactly the same way as Europe stumbled into war at the beginning of the 20th century.
Thank you, Allan. Very wise. Next question. Victor.
And you can.
I'm sorry.
I just add a somewhat different take on this. I'm a big fan of globalization. Otherwise, I would not have taken up the directorship of AGI. But at the same time, I have to say that the kind of globalization until recently should be changed, should be adjusted to some extent, at least. As we all know, from 1980 onward, basically, especially business people would not want to ask questions about what you believe in, what values you have, whether your economic, political system is for individual rights or not. Let's just do business. As long as you can help me make money, I'm not going to ask tough questions about what you are, what you represent, and so on. So for the betterment of humanity, I think it is time to actually reassess. Do you really don't care, or should you really care whether the business partner you are making money with is someone you can be friends with, sharing common beliefs, common values, and so on. So in that sense, even the WTO is very much values mutual, right? So as long as we can do business together, whether you are dominated by state-owned enterprises or have a free market economy like the Hong Kong economy and so on, does not really matter. Let's just do business. So I think in that sense, this new wave that is causing a reassessment of the global trade system, it's actually good for humanity, in the long term, right? I'm sounding too much like an idealistic person, yeah.
Okay, Victor, sorry.
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I'd like to really thank the panel. These are really some very thought-provoking questions. What I'd like to address to the panel is the following. In the early days of multilateralism, I remember we were very concerned about the development of trade blocs. We think it's one global system. We'd like to keep everybody together. Now, in today, I think the realities are that there will be fragmentation or balkanization, and all the way, not only on the arena, but also extending to cyberspace. But I think if we recognize that, then I think maybe the new multilateralism has to be a global system in which we recognize that there could be different, shall we say, different groupings, but there must be open regionalism, where we actually be able to move freely and trade and move information between these groupings. In Sam Palmisano's words, the best is if we set one global standard for the internet. But if that is an impossibility, at least we have a harmonization of standards and not conflicting, blocks. So if we do that, then we should think about the new multilateralism as how we come up with a system to harmonize different blocks and recognizing the realities of the blocks, that these should be open regionalism. The idea that these are blocks that are not exclusionary, that if you want to join, that you could join on your own right, etc. And then the whole idea about globalization, I think really has to be taken to a much more inclusive people-to-people level. And indeed, that may become the infrastructure on which we can build this slightly more balkanized grouping at the more country level and multilateral level. I just like to throw that idea to the panel and see what their reaction is.
Great. We're running out of time. My bad moderation. 1 minute each. Zhiwu, why don't we start with you and then come back?
I share Victor's views that there has to be a new multilateralism-based global order for trade. If I can cite some statistics, the correlation between population size and economic size for a country used to be 100% before the Industrial Revolution and before the first round of globalization. But during then after about 1800, the correlation between economic size and population size started to decline as the Industrial Revolution was having some more and more effect on the different, first on the Western societies. So the lowest point in correlation between the two was towards the end of the Cold War in the 1970s. So it was something like 35%. But since then, with this new round of globalization under the previous multilateral system, the correlation between population size and economic size was steadily rising. So that led to large population countries like China and then soon India to also have very large economies, right? So you can see how a multilateral system can really help lift the living standards and income levels for all countries, especially developing large population countries.
Great. We just go in order.
I'll just have 2 points to say. I fundamentally agree with what you said, Dr. Fang. The issue is there are already regional trade groupings existing in terms of SAFTA, NAFTA, you name a thing, number of them are existing actually speaking. But all these are actually coming into play basically because you have a Westphalian state system wherein you have territories, boundaries marked clearly. Where you find softer boundaries, you will find these things will work better. The issue, the example of European Union also you can take into this kind of a system. Fundamentally, what you're saying is absolutely correct in the sense that if you have increased the people-to-people contact, obviously then the rest of the block can be built on this. The basic problem comes up when you have other national interests coming into play with this. So that is where we need to take a call to say, how do we overcome these national interests and then go into a softer boundary kind of a related region on which people-to-people contacts, connectivity is another issue that you need to look into. If you look into these, then probably you can build a block on this subsequently. I agree with you on that.
Tanaka-san.
I think what you described must be the right way for considering the future multilateral trading mechanism, multilateralism. But yet, let's think this way. The reason why the multilateral mechanism worked, that was because of the fact that what we call G7, Western nations, has got 70% of GDP share. Therefore, they were able to establish norms. But today, their strength is much less than 50%. Therefore, the same way of handling the multilateral framework is not possible. Then let's talk about the kind of broken down regional type combination of multilateral gatherings. But there should be one important element needed to be retained by, for instance, WTO, dispute settlement mechanism. That needs to be there. And the second question is, if you take NAFTA, NAFTA is very, very local regional agreement because they are talking about the local component questions. And those countries outside NAFTA is not relevant. Therefore, you talked about regionalism, combining it. I think it depends a kind of regional setups as well. And if you look at Asia, East Asia, we have already TPP 11 and RCEP. India is opposed to be much more generous in terms of tariff. And again, for the regional arrangement, access issue is the most important, most difficult issue. But end of the day, I'm sure RCEP will come true. Therefore, for the future, I think it is very important, as you say, how to combine those, regionally broken down multilateral mechanism into a sort of consolidated type of international mechanism. But I agree to your point.
Allan, your last word.
Open regionalism is at the basis of APEC, of course, and needs to be continued. But as the smaller economy on this panel of China and India and Japan, although I'm not an economist, I've hung around economists long enough to know that the best outcome is a multilateral system which encourages free and open trade. So we may have to make concessions around the edges, but we should not back away from the efforts to make the WTO work, and if that, as it obviously will, requires adjustments, we should make them. That should be the centre.
Thank you very much, Allan. This reminds me that small countries have big minds. Okay, we come to the end of this session. In 1990, Francis Fukuyama famously wrote The End of History. What we have now discovered is that there is no end of history, no end of geography, no end of demography. It is the end of telegraphy, but only the beginning of a very major conversation in which monologues do not work. And I think that's the whole purpose of the Asian Global Dialogue, to have many perspectives into this conversation that will take us to a new age. On that note, let us thank this wonderful panel for its great insights at the start of the day. Thank you very much indeed. Terrific, Allan.
Thanks, Andrew.